and welcome to Film Fam, inspired by true events. I'm Heather, married to Brian and mother to Zoe.
Hi, I'm Brian, husband to Heather, father to Zoe.
Hi, I'm Zoe, daughter to Heather and Brian.
We're the Grays and we're your Film Fam, and we are still doing this intro in case you don't know our names or our relationships. We don't want you to think we're all siblings or cousins or...
Maybe you guys are my grandparents. Because you're old.
Grandfather to Heather. Second cousin once removed to Zoe.
Right. They need to know the relationship. You're our child, Zoe.
Yes,
little baby
yes.
child.
Were you asking for confirmation?
Yes. Today we are talking about Frankenstein. I'm so excited. I love that you both did that. We're going to be talking about the true events that inspired both the 1931 movie, the original, and the novel, 1818, I think. Again, it's a 1931 sci-fi horror film directed by James Whale, W-H-A-L-E, Whale, like the ocean
Like shark
creature, like shark. That is not our only callback to Jaws we're going to have tonight, by the way.
Just, this is primarily a Jaws podcast, and any other movie we talk about is just tangential.
It's all connected to Jaws.
Also, can I clarify a point? The genre of horror was not actually a genre when this came out, but we do recognize it as a horror film.
That's right. That's right. It was a few years after that they were like, oh, I guess we need to create a genre and it's going to be called horror.
This was just called a movie, right?
It was just a creepy movie that they had only done once before in the movie Dracula. Frankenstein's the second talkie horror film that came out. Dracula was the first and just came out earlier the same year. It did well. So they're like, all right, let's make another one. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So directed by James Whale, starring Colin Clive as Frankenstein, the scientist, and Boris Karloff as the monster / creature. I'll call him either the monster or the creature.
I prefer monster because creature to me means the creature from the Black Lagoon.
Well, I'm noting your preferences.
But he's the creature in the script. Although one version called him Adam, but I think we can steer clear of just giving him a name.
Yes, we will. So James Whale, before Frankenstein comes out, he's already a well-regarded director. He came over from London when movies in Hollywood were making the transition from silent to talkies. And they needed someone. They were like, I guess we need directors that know how to direct dialogue and talking. So they went to stage directors. And that's what James Whale was. He had been a stage director in London. He and a bunch of British actors, and they all came over around this time to start working in Hollywood. They'd just come out with Dracula earlier that year. And like I said, it had been a really big success and they wanted to do another monster film. And so James looked through the catalog of works that they could draw from and chose Frankenstein, which is the tale of a sympathetic monster / outsider who is unloved by his creator. James Whale, I think, had an affinity for this story because he himself was an outsider. He grew up outside of London in a mining town, kind of a lower class mining town. And when he went to London, kind of remade himself as a gentleman. But, there's real class differences in London that are very sticky. So other people who were of the class he was trying to enter into were kind of like, no, you don't really. Although in America, he could be an English gentleman. He was also openly but discreetly homosexual. That is another way that he was an outsider his whole life. At the time, it was even a criminal behavior to be homosexual in England and in America. In London, he had been engaged to a woman, but he did not marry her. And in the US, he met David Lewis, a producer, and they lived together for most of the rest of his life. And so even though it was illegal to be gay or illegal to have gay sex, and it could definitely ruin your career in Hollywood if it was public, still, like, if you knew him and you were at all kind of like sophisticated and knew about this kind of stuff, you knew he was gay.
Okay, but he was able to draw on being engaged to a woman and then not getting married.
Yeah, you see where I'm going here. So he was discreet about it, but he wasn't in the closet. James Whale, I just want to let you know, in case you guys don't know, he made 4 of the essential horror movies. He made Frankenstein in 1931, a movie called The Old Dark House, which is a kind of prototypical haunted house movie. The year after that, then he made The Invisible Man with Claude Rains. And then Bride of Frankenstein, which many consider to be his masterpiece, and I'd love to talk about that in a future episode. So Whale, he was a powerful director, working with Carl Laemmle Jr. At the Universal Studios, and he had almost total control of his films. So he was the director, but also the producer. He cast them, he guided set and costume designs. So when you see any of these movies that I'm talking about, they're his films. Like, they're very much him, and he is the idea behind them. Whale was inspired by German expressionist cinema. If you've seen like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Fritz Lang's Metropolis, that's German expressionist cinema. And they use oversized angular sets and like dramatic light and shadows to create this kind of mood that's a lot darker and different than what people were doing in America at that time. And Whale also kind of borrowed from Metropolis all the sci-fi gadgets that they use to kind of populate the...
Oh, is that the stuff that was in the lab?
Yeah, the mad scientists, the idea of them, the look of them.
Ah, I see.
I just had a forbidden memory re-enter my brain of being, oh God, like 10 years old. And for a class project, after I read Frankenstein, I had to make a trailer for it. And we set up in the basement. Dad, you were Victor Frankenstein.
I remember that.
And we got just like pots and pans and like coils and anything we could that looked, like those
we need to link to that.
Yeah, for sure.
That needs to be an
I don't know if
extra
I
for
want
the
people
listeners
to
of this
see
podcast.
my little like voiceover recording of 10-year-old Zoe reading the trailer for Frankenstein.
I feel like they do want to see that. Why is that forbidden? Did you block it out? Is it a recovered memory?
I might have. I had a lot of interesting projects as a literary-minded homeschooler. Like when I made a Emily Sockinson, a sock puppet who recited Emily Dickinson poetry.
Those are great. Yes. Hey, shout out to Online G3. That's where a lot of your projects came from, right?
Ooh.
So Whale also brought to the film his own real life experiences of being an outsider. He was a homosexual in a society where homosexuality was not only criminal, but like considered a crime against the institution of the family and like a crime against God, right? So in the opening scene of Frankenstein, we see Victor, or in this movie, he's called Henry Frankenstein, the scientist, and his assistant, Fritz, creeping around on the outskirts of a cemetery watching a funeral. And they're there to do some grave robbing and to collect body parts for Frankenstein's experiments. When the funeral's over and the grave digger leaves, Henry and Fritz, like they creep in the graveyard and they pass this huge crucifix grave marker. And you get the sense that what they're doing, this is the very first scene, is like they're doing something that's like unholy, that they're going against God somehow. It's a very kind of creepy scene of them digging up this dead body basically under a crucifix. We find out that Henry Frankenstein left his fiancée, Elizabeth, on the day after they got engaged. And he goes and shuts himself up in his laboratory / windmill that he lives in or that he's working in so he can work on making a man, making life out of dead tissue.
Gay.
And he's obsessed with it to the point of like committing crimes like grave robbing and directing Fritz to steal a specimen brain from his old college professor, Henry's college professor. And we'll get back to the brain theft in a bit. And Henry Frankenstein, he won't be put off from his experiment. His father is really upset that he won't come home and get married. And his fiance is worried, and his best friend's also like trying to talk him into coming home. And his old professor, Dr. Waldman, is like, he's a lost cause, but I guess I'll try to help him get back in line and back to his normal life. And Frankenstein's like, you guys are on my way. Why can't you just leave me alone to do my thing? And so he does his thing, and he and Fritz, they put the body parts, the monster on the table, and they pull it up into the lightning storm, and all the equipment is like blinking and buzzing and bubbling and stuff like that. And the lightning strikes, and then It's alive. That whole scene happens, and Frankenstein's monster is born, and he's this like sweet little creature, sweet huge creature with the strength of 10 men, and no one to love him.
When you use the metaphor in this way, it makes me actually really approve of everything that Frankenstein does that I didn't originally. But when you say that it's about being gay, now I just instinctively have to be like, that's tight. I approve.
I didn't say that, but I was just about to say that.
I inferred.
Yes. There's this really touching scene when they first bring the monster on screen. Henry's fiance and friend are gone from the windmill laboratory, and it's just Henry, Frankenstein, and his old professor and the creature. And Henry says that the creature has been kept in the darkness of the cellar the past few days. Since he was born, basically. He's been in the darkness of the cellar. And this is the creature's first time like out and about in the windmill. And the creature's sitting all awkwardly on this chair with like his arms at this weird angle because his body is all at weird angles. And suddenly sunlight like shines down from an opening above him, probably the same opening that like his body was raised through when he got struck by lightning.
Yeah, I bet that is.
And it shines down on him, and the creature just can't believe what he's seeing. It's like, it's so beautiful. And he's raising his like trembling hands to the sunlight, and then he stands up his whole body, and he's just like reveling in the warmth and the sun on his face, and he's like reaching towards the sun, and then Henry Frankenstein's like, no, just sit down. I want you to just sit down. He's just not paying attention to like what this moment is meaning to the creature. He's just like, why? I told you to sit. You're standing. What are you doing? So the monster like moves his hands really emotively, like beseechingly at Henry, kind of like saying like, I want something. Like, I don't know what it is I want, but it's like something about this light and this warmth, and I want this, please. And Frankenstein's just like, no, just sit down. Just do what I'm telling you. Sit down. And it's really sad and really well done. And this is like one of the first inklings where you really have to be wondering who the monster is in this relationship, because the creature does not seem violent or, bad. And Henry's just really not giving him any kind of attention.
Yeah, there's this whole debate about it. Should we call the monster for, because it's been called Frankenstein, partly because of Bride of Frankenstein. After that came out, people are like, okay, well, he just named it after himself. Some people are like, it's named Frankenstein. Some people say it's Frankenstein's monster. I would like to contribute to the discourse by saying that I think that Frankenstein's monster is the doctor.
He's the true monster.
But I'm pretty sure the monster is named Bruce.
The monster is not named Jaws.
Okay, that's a callback. Now, so yeah, this scene, it's very moving. And just before this scene, Henry Frankenstein is sitting there and he's telling Dr. Waldman that his creature is good and that they just need to be patient and give it time to learn and grow. And Henry is feeling happy and he feels successful about what he's doing. And Dr. Waldman tells Henry that the brain that Fritz stole was a criminal brain. And Henry just, at that moment, he just looks like really uncomfortable and kind of shaken. After the doctor tells Henry that, Henry's interactions with the creature becomes like very cruel. So he went from like being willing to commit crimes to make this creature, but when he's told that the creature may be like intrinsically bad and that there's something wrong with it, something wrong with its brain, he's like much more willing to let the creature be tortured and killed.
Right, so like if he hadn't been told that, who knows how it would have ended up, because also like criminal brain, I'm using air quotes for the podcast, people who cannot see my air quotes, is such a weird, like, does that imply that you cannot learn from a childlike state to be a good person if you're in good circumstance? I mean, there's obviously a lot to unpack.
Well,
there,
and I think that James Whale interrogates that too, because even if he does have the quote criminal brain, he really doesn't behave badly until, he's forced to defend himself.
Yeah, and the only crimes that he commits in this movie or the next are mostly either out of self-defense or on accident because he's like a
Yes.
child that doesn't
Yeah.
know how to engage with the world. And actually, those are like the most heartbreaking scenes. That one's in The Bride of Frankenstein, I think, but where he unintentionally hurts people, and it's just not knowing your own strength, you know?
Well, he did in this one, in the scene with the little girl. He unintentionally drowned her.
Right. Well, yeah. So it seems like Zoe already picked up where I'm going with this. I think you can easily read the creature in Frankenstein as Whale's homosexuality or his gay self that just wants to be accepted and loved, just wants to live out of the darkness of the cellar, out in the sunshine, just wants to learn about the world and himself in safety. And instead, he's met with hatred, disgust, and violence. And of course, there's other ways to view this movie, but I think if you watch it with this in mind, it's actually very clear.
Yeah.
A pretty obvious way of looking at it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, after Henry and Dr. Waldman, they try to kill the creature. Henry goes back home to his fiance and his father's toasting everyone in the house to a son of the House of Frankenstein. And like the mandate is to like procreate. And Henry just looks like really uncomfortable. And that's the point where the monster was about to be dissected while still alive by the professor. And he kills the professor and escapes the windmill. And he shows up at the house and he attacks Elizabeth, the fiance, and then he flees. And Elizabeth fainted while she's being attacked. And when she wakes up, she's like in shock. It's like when she saw what Henry's monster was like, she went in shock and
That's
she couldn't
right.
speak anymore. She could only like stare and be in shock. So at this point now, everyone knows about the monster. Like Brian said, he accidentally killed a village child and then ran from the scene. And now there's an angry mob with pitchforks hunting him through the hillside. And Henry Frankenstein, he joins the angry mob against his own creation, and he's leading one of the groups. It's like he was committed to this creature before the professor told him that the creature had a bad brain and that needed to be put down like a wild animal.
Right, and that can kind of, I mean, that's kind of, if we're reading deeply into this metaphor, it's like if you were gay as a little kid in a universe where that was not an issue and it was just something that you were excited about and wanted to explore, and then someone told you like, no, there's something intrinsically wrong with you for wanting that, I mean, then that's where the internalized homophobia, if that's him joining the mob, you know, it's like he didn't think it was a bad thing until someone told him it was, and maybe it wouldn't have had to be if no one had told him it was, but like then it became tainted and he became hateful towards this part of himself or the thing that he created, and towards his own self because it's a destructive force in his life, but like it might not have had to have been, you know?
Right, and he's leading. He's not just joining in on the mob, but he's leading. He's taking control of the idea that no, I'm going to kill this thing that I created. Maybe by doing that, redeeming himself in the eyes of people who see him or see the monster.
Right. Like, if I am the one to hate it the most, then we can all forget that I'm actually the thing that it was born of, you know?
Right. We see that a lot in real life.
Right. But think about, this is one of the things I think is like so smart, is that James Whale, I mean, he was openly gay. He didn't hate himself. He wasn't in the closet. He wasn't trying to kill that part of himself, but he was trying to show people maybe with this reading of it that that's bad. Like, you don't want to do that.
Sure, he'd probably seen it. He probably had friends and saw how destructive it can be.
Well, he very much had friends. Colin Clive, who played Frankenstein, was a bisexual man. And in The Bride of Frankenstein, and also the same actor was in The Old Dark House, the actor who plays Pretorius, who's kind of like the very archly gay guy in Bride of Frankenstein. He was a very openly homosexual guy who was always like played as like a gay coded character. And in this Old Dark House, Charles Laughton, he was a gay man, but he was married to Elsa Lancaster, who played the Bride of Frankenstein. She was the bride. Huh. So all these people, all his friends were gay, and he was putting them in all of his movies, and they were, I mean, out or not out. Apparently, Colin Clive was not out and was like kind of driven to alcoholism.
Well, that's just more proof to me that this is a very valid way to read this movie, is because I think some people can be like, even if you're a gay director or writer, that doesn't mean everything you do has to be about being gay, which as a gay director and writer, I kind of take issue with, especially if you're an artist who is surrounded by other queer artists. If you're in the industry trying to be out in the 1930s, like
Right.
if it were me, there would be no way that that isn't a major part of my work.
So in the end, sadly, the mob actually wins. They trapped in the burning windmill. The creature's like screaming and pleading and trying to escape, and they set fire to it. And it's like that's his main fear. That's what he was tortured by with Fritz, and he is seemingly burned to death in the windmill. Although we get a sequel and then many sequels after that, but it's the very last scene right after that that's very interesting as well. Henry Frankenstein, he is back home, but we barely see him. We just see him through a doorway, and he's lying on a bed. Elizabeth is sitting on the chair next to him, and we see them from a distance. And the scene focuses on the maids of the house and Henry's father celebrating that, like, Henry's back home, he lived. And the father says, to a son of the house of Frankenstein. And that's the happy ending, is that Henry came back to have his heteronormative life and to procreate, but it just actually doesn't, we don't see him happy. We only see his father is happy and other people in the household is happy. And we just moments ago watched the creature that we all felt for die this horrible, painful death in a very sad way. So I don't think we're actually supposed to be happy. I don't think we're supposed to be like, yay, this ended well. And most people didn't feel that way. The audience actually felt so much empathy for the creature that it said that Universal received countless letters meant for Karloff, offering him help and friendship.
Oh,
That I'm so touched.
I know. Are you gonna cry?
yeah.
They're like writing letters to the actor, like, "I will be your friend. I'm sorry that you're so alone." And Boris Karloff said it was one of the most moving experiences of his life.
That is so sweet.
So yeah, in real life, James Whale did not get married and procreate. He lived quietly as a gay man, and he made 4 essential Universal horror movies. And he is the author of the version of Frankenstein that most people are familiar with, and all the inspiration for all the versions of the monster that came after, like Young Frankenstein and the Munsters and Rocky Horror Picture Show, Frankenberry cereal. All of that is his Frankenstein.
I was thinking about Rocky Horror when you mentioned the scene where they're digging under the crucifix. I'm just realizing that I bet the opening scene to Rocky Horror is an homage to that, where they're walking through the cemetery and there's all these crosses and then like put the heart on a billboard, and it's just this, again, a juxtaposition in a much more clearly, not even queer coded, just queer way in that movie of juxtaposing like Christianity with like debauched or immoral acts.
Well, totally. And I actually feel like Richard O'Brien, who wrote Rocky, was even more brilliant than I already think, since I've been doing this research. And I want to watch Rocky Horror again with this kind of eye, like
Can we do
a
Rocky
more
Horror on
critical.
this podcast?
100%. We
Was
can
it
and we
based
will.
on a
What
true
new are we
story?
going to introduce
I don't know.
that inspired it as a true story?
I'll have to see. I'll have to see what was up with Richard
Frankenstein?
O'Brien.
I feel like this is like one of the movies that people would write in on their reviews and say, do something fake about that.
So after this movie, James Whale's at the top of his career. He makes those 4 more movies. He makes some other movies. But just 10 years later, he is pushed out of the industry or leaves it voluntarily. It's a little complicated. It may or may not have been about his sexual orientation. The book Celluloid Closet thinks it was, but it's not definitive. And then 16 years later, after a series of strokes, he commits suicide in his swimming pool.
Oh, that's sad.
It is sad. And hopefully he had a good life for at least a big portion of it. And he actually had 2 nicknames. I don't think he liked either one of them. One was, I think, the Queen of Hollywood. So, and the other one was the Monster Man.
I love it.
That could be very flattering, being the Monster Man.
Isn't that a callback to Frank Mundus from our first
Yes.
episode?
Yeah.
So we've had 2 guys now.
I just like Monster Men.
We like Monster Men.
Shape of Water.
So I want to do a quick shout out to Peggy Webling, who wrote the stage adaptation that James Whale based the movie on. She was the first woman to adapt Frankenstein for the stage. And it was from the stage plays that a lot of the differences came from. Her play was called Frankenstein, An Adventure in the Macabre. Her version and other stage versions from that time, Victor's name was changed to Henry, and the plays introduced an assistant named Fritz or Igor, and that is when the creature became mute. So that wasn't James Whale's invention. It came from stage plays. All right, so now we get to Mary Goodwin Shelley and the true events of her life that inspired the original Frankenstein story. And oh boy, this shit is bananas. I love it. It's also really
B-A-N-A-N-A-S.
It's also kind of sad, so be prepared. I don't know if I need to include a trigger warning for child death and mother death.
And
Suicide. Yes. Yeah. So Mary's parents were both famous in their own time. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote a vindication of the rights of woman. And her father was a political philosopher, anarchist, and novelist. And they were both radicals who lived their radical philosophies. And when their daughter was born in 1797, they planned to raise her as a political radical as well. But 11 days after giving birth, Mary Wollstonecraft died of an infection introduced to her body by the doctor's unclean fingers, removing her placenta. Because it didn't expel naturally, and he just had to pull it out, and she ended up getting an infection. So Mary, even though it wasn't Mary's fault, she didn't quote, kill her mother. She spent her life dealing with the idea that it was her birth that killed her own mother, who was a very renowned and singular famous woman. And this tangle of birth and death and love and bodies and graves becomes a central theme in Mary Godwin Shelley's life and in her writing. Her father even taught her how to write by having her trace the letters of her mother's name on her gravestone.
Wow, that is on her gravestone?
Oh, Zoe, there's so much gravestone action going on in her life.
Well, I like the words gravestone action, but not used like that.
Well, throughout her life as a child, she would go to the graveyard and just sit on her mother's grave constantly. That's where she hung out, and read her mother's books and journal to herself and write.
Right, and they had coffee tables made out of gravestones. They would use them as plates. They would eat off of them. Gravestones were just everywhere.
They were a major decorative element of most graveyards, in fact.
As someone who has hung out in cemeteries for fun, that is the most romantic shit. And by romantic, I mean
capital R.
Yeah.
Literal romantic.
So William Godwin, he remarried, and then Mary spent even more time in the graveyard because she didn't like her new stepmom. So she was the original goth teenager, literally.
Hell yeah.
So there's strife in the home between Mary and her stepmother, but there's also, and I think you're going to like this, Zoe, there's also really interesting people always visiting because they were political radicals. So famous poets and writers and politicians. And our friend, Aaron Burr, actually hung out with the Goodwin family for a while.
Oh, not our good friend Aaron Burr.
Oh, no. Did he shoot first?
Because, he was a feminist and he wanted to raise his daughter with the ideas that Mary Wollstonecraft had about the rights of women and their education.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
You succeeded.
Oh, thank you. So Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner, was a friend and would come and hang out. And also a young radical poet who had recently been kicked out of school for atheism and disowned by his father for marrying a 16-year-old girl, Percy Shelley, would come to visit.
I have really mixed feelings about those things. Like, one of them I think is cool. The other one makes me not love Percy Shelley.
Yeah, there's a lot to feel those conflicting emotions about with this guy. I'll go on. In May of 1814, Percy Shelley, he's 22 years old and married, and he's visiting the Godwin house, and he and Mary would go on walks together. Guess where? To the graveyard. That's their favorite place to hang out. And they would talk about politics and art and ideas. And then in June, they declare their love for each other on Mary's mother's gravesite.
I mean, that's how it goes.
And then they have sex there on the grave.
You had to go there.
How do you actually? She had extensive journals, so that's probably how you know. But like, for real,
That's the story. She hooked up and lost her V card with a married poet on her dead mother's grave.
I mean, I gotta say, like, mad respect. Like, I don't know if it's cool for him to be cheating on his wife with if he was 17-year-old, but from her point of view, I mean, get it, girl. Get it on your mom's grave if you want. Like, it's committed to the lifestyle of
She's
being
committed.
a goth hoe.
That's it. We are cremating in this family from now on.
Oh, gosh. Thank you for going there, Brian. Okay.
Say that.
Okay, so badass proto-feminist free love radical William Godwin was really not so much into these ideas when they started to be applied by his daughter. He was against their relationship, and so in July, the couple, they fled to Europe, and they brought Mary's 1 year younger stepsister, Claire Claremont, with them, and they did not bring Percy's wife, Harriet, who was pregnant with his child.
That's really rough. Also, I gotta say, I immediately felt bad about calling Mary Shelley a hoe, and I really want to retract that statement.
Thank you. It is retracted officially. Let me
Okay.
enter it
in
in.
a positive way.
Maybe we can avoid a slander suit from the Shelley estate.
Yeah, or maybe the people who come and punch you out for talking shit about Mary Shelley, that group.
I'll take it. That's fair.
Any goth has the right to do that.
I'll punch my own self.
All right, Percy, Mary, and her stepsister, Claire, they traveled to Calais, Paris, said by donkey, mule, carriage, and on foot. They went through France to Switzerland.
Okay, so what is a donkey mule?
By donkey, comma, mule. Okay.
Can I interject upon this point in the timeline?
Yes.
No, I just want to say that Mary Shelley was still being goth, and also with Claire Claremont, who went with them for some reason. She decided to tag along, and they were just like telling each other horror stories and trying to freak each other out as hard as they possibly could. And they were like, we want to start an association of philosophical people where only women are in charge. And like, it's like Claire was with them along the journey. She becomes an important player later, which is why I'm noting it.
I'm glad to
That's the
hear that.
stepsister.
I'm glad to hear that because I feel like it would have been worse for Mary in some ways if it was just her and Percy. Like she needed another woman there, although it ended up not always being great. We'll get to that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So as they traveled, though, this was still like the little cute time between Mary and Percy. They read and they wrote and they kept a joint journal.
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
That's pretty cute.
It's cute. And
It's just
mean,
cute. No.
yeah,
it's
let's say it's only cute.
cute. We're going with cute.
No violation
So-
of privacy there.
I think she also had other journals, perhaps, but they also kept one together.
Okay. Then
So they
it's cute.
traveled down Germany and the Netherlands, and then they ended up back in England by September. So from July to September, they were traveling all over Europe, and then they came back because they were out of money, and Mary was pregnant.
You know who I bet this was all really cute for? Percy Shelley's wife that he was still married to.
Right.
Yes.
What about their shared journal?
It was just letters they were sending back and forth.
Were they though?
It was just her
Maybe.
writing in her journal being like,
Why
I'm
haven't I heard
imagining
from
what
you?
he would say.
I'm sure you're just pining over me. I feel bad that you're so alone over there.
Free love. Yay. So they come back in September. Mary's pregnant. And this is where things, forewarning, this is the sad part. In February, Mary gave birth to a 2-month premature baby girl. They named her Clara, and 2 weeks later, baby Clara died. And Mary was only 17 at that point. And she writes in her diary, leading up to it, she writes, nurse the baby, read, nurse the baby, read. Until the 11th day, she writes, I awoke in the night to give it suck. It appeared to be sleeping so quietly that I would not wake it. And then in the morning, find my baby dead.
You're right, that is sad.
Yeah. A few weeks after Clara died, Mary wrote in her journal, dreamed that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold and we rubbed it by the fire and it lived. I awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day.
So already you can kind of see like the ways that could have impacted her story.
Sure.
I never thought about that.
Yes. So Mary, she's deeply depressed by the loss of her child. And like you're saying, Zoe, here's that tangle again. Birth, death, love, bodies, sex, graves. It's all so tangled for her. And she felt guilt over her mother's death and also like a sense of her mother abandoned her and abandoned by her father over her relationship with Percy. And now, while Mary was like deeply grieving and depressed, Percy was spending more and more time with Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, and probably having an affair. But he wasn't like officially cheating because they believed in, quote, free love. But like with your stepsister, right after your baby died, that's pretty shitty.
Yeah.
In my opinion, in my little humble opinion over here. So Mary blames her father and Percy for abandoning her. And she blamed herself for like the death and destruction that she felt like her love and her body causes. So again, birth and death and love and graves and bodies, it's all, you can see where it's coming for Mary Shelley. I think the true events that inspired Frankenstein are Mary's own grief for the loss of her mother, the love of her father, and Shelley's support. And
Sure.
if William Goodwin and Percy are Victor Frankenstein, then Mary herself is the monster. And I think the creature's anger is Mary's anger. Like something in Mary, she feels like killed her mother, killed her baby, drove away her father, and like can't engender like a solid commitment from Percy Shelley. But like, shouldn't they cling to her anyways? Shouldn't they love her anyways? When Mary finished Frankenstein, she published it anonymously because she was worried that people would not be able to deal with the idea that a woman wrote it, especially like such a teenager. And one critic said it was horrible and disgusting and that the author must be mad. And it was quite a scandal when the authorship was revealed. That's when she wrote, how I, that a young girl, came to think of and to dilate upon so very hideous an idea. And she said it was a dream, but maybe that's because like the male audience was not ready for like a monstrous woman and a woman, especially a young woman who could create this darkness and horror.
Right. People didn't want to think that a young woman would think that way. That's not what they're supposed to be thinking about.
But it must have not just been her because like, yes, like her mother died, her baby died, but so many women died in childbirth. So many women had their children die. So this was something that many women went through. And it's one of the reasons this is a feminist book and that women have loved this book for so long. One critic wrote that Mary, once it came out that she was the author, he wrote that she had a diseased imagination, which stepped out of all legitimate bonds.
I gotta say, as a kind of goth, I hope she was like super proud of those reviews because as a chick who liked to hang out in cemeteries, having like these male critics write about your well-regarded opus, like, man, you have a twisted mind. Like, yeah, I mean, like, isn't that sort of a victory in some ways to prove like, yes, I'm a woman and I can think of these fucked up yet very emotional, very intellectual things.
Yes, I hope she did think that. So to end this part here, that same critic said, this is a quote from him. He said, "The writer is, we understand, a female. But if our authoress can forget the gentleness of her sex, there's no reason why we should, and we shall therefore dismiss this novel without further comment."
Boo.
Right, well, it wasn't dismissed. It's a foundational Gothic horror. It spawned the concept of the mad scientist. This is where it came from.
Wow.
And the concept of something being like Frankenstein, sewn together from disparate parts. And it's also considered one of the first science fiction novels. So fuck that guy. And yay to Goth Mary Shelley. So that's my part of it. And I guess that leads us into Brian.
Wow. What should I talk about? Something that inspired Frankenstein. I figured of all the things that I could talk about, I think the most interesting thing to talk about in any given situation is the weather.
Oh, the weather.
Yeah. I mean,
And now the weather.
what's your go-to? What's your go-to? You're in the elevator with somebody. Hey,
Do you talk about having sex on a grave, or do you talk about the weather?
Oh, well,
I'm going to be talking about the weather. And I mean, it seems now this is the third time I've done this. And every time I want to talk about something, I realize, no, I have to go way back in time to set up how I'm talking about the thing. And it reminded me of Watchmen. At the end, Rorschach is like, nothing ever ends. And I'm starting to believe nothing ever begins.
Do you need some way back music?
Yeah. So let's go back to the 6th century CE.
Oh my gosh.
like way back. Is this that
Settle
movie, The
in.
Way,
I
Way
think
Back,
he needs
is
a
about
lot more
this?
of. Go do that for a few minutes.
Yeah, settle in because we're going way, way back. So what happened in the 6th century CE was what ended up being a century cooling event, an extreme weather event that started very specifically in 535 or 536 CE. And it's called the Late Antique Little Ice Age.
Aww.
That is adorable. And I would purchase a late antique little ice age and put it on my mantle.
Late Antique Little Ice Age is the name of my Arctic Monkey cover band.
So this little ice age could have been caused by a comet or meteorite, but the high levels of sulfates in the soil point very, very strongly to volcano. And scientists are never certain about anything. They will never say, this happened, it's a fact, I'm certain about it. They're always like, all the evidence to date points toward this. And it was
Scientists.
not just a volcano, but the largest volcano event that anyone has been able to discover in the course of humans being human, which makes it a very recent example of this. Because even if you just say civilization, that's maybe 15,000 years ago, and this was about 1,500 years ago. So pretty
And it
recent.
inspired Frankenstein.
And yeah, and then they wrote Frankenstein. There we go. It was so big that nobody knows where the volcano was. It didn't make it into history. Nobody who saw it happen reported on it.
They died.
Because they were all dead.
They were probably all dead, or it happened somewhere where they weren't writing yet. It could have been in Iceland. There's theories about it being in the tropics. It's a very common and popular subject for researchers who want to publish something. They come up with a new idea of where it might have been, and the ideas are all over the place. But that goes to show how big an event it was, because it's not like some part of the world was destroyed and other parts had a small effect from it. This really was globally devastating. But agricultural failures as a result of this led to the world shifting around. I don't mean the crust, I mean the people on the earth had to migrate. Places that were fertile became infertile, and they had to find new places, and there were wars and migrations. Agricultural failures might have directly led to the abandonment of Teotihuacan by the original inhabitants, the increased food supply in the Arabian Peninsula, and strain on the Eastern Roman Empire led to easing the Muslim conquests of the Levant, Egypt, and Persia because they were better supplied. It contributed to the migrations of the Lombards and Slavs into Roman territory in Italy and the Balkans. It may have been an explanation for the deposition of hoards of gold by Scandinavian elites at the end of the migration period. And linked to that, it was possibly a sacrifice to appease the gods, and mythological events such as Fimbulwinter and Ragnarok may be based on the cultural memory of this event.
Oh,
I'm sorry,
wow.
what is Thimblewinter? Because that sounds fucking adorable.
That
But it's probably not.
exceeds my research on the subject. I didn't look into Fimbulwinter.
Oh,
Thimblewinter.
it's not Thimblewinter?
With an F.
Okay, because that sounds like a
Thimble.
gnome surname.
I'm also calling that for my gnome character's name.
Hi, my name is
Thimblewinter.
Ragnarok Thimblewinter, and I'm definitely not going to bring about the apocalypse.
So, in 1816, Sorry, I wrote something weird and... Okay,
What did you write?
I know what I wrote now.
What did you write?
1,300 years later.
Okay,
But I
we're keeping
wrote it
this whole
out
bit.
phonetically to remind me to do the joke, and then I didn't know what I wrote, so the joke...
SpongeBob. Our first SpongeBob
I think the
reference.
joke is much better now that you explained it and messed it up.
1,300 years later. Okay. So 1,300 years later, in the early 19th century, the world experienced the year without a summer, otherwise known as the poverty year, and 1800 and froze to death.
Woo.
Average global temperatures decreased by about 1 degree Fahrenheit.
Burr.
And call back to Burr. Wow, you're right on the callback game. Your references are off the hook.
Ring, ring. Guess who just called back? It's Mom.
Summer temperatures in Europe were the coldest on record between 1766 and 2000.
Wow.
And there were major food shortages all across the northern hemisphere, mostly. And the cause of this is historical. The cause of this was documented as an April 5th, 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in modern-day Indonesia. It's a mountain and an island, and the village of Tambora. It's all one thing. On April 15th, it exploded. More explosions over the next few days, intensifying until April 11th, so 6 days later, when the whole mountain was turned into a flowing mass of liquid fire. Liquid fire in quotes, an historian documented it as such. Pumice stones, molten, flaming, of up to 8 inches in diameter, were raining down, followed by ash. Pyroclastic flows cascaded down the mountain to the sea on all sides, wiped out the entire island,
Wow.
wiped out the entire village. Some 10 to 12,000 inhabitants
Oh.
just completely gone. The mountain itself lost 4,746 feet of elevation. So it was a 14,000-foot mountain. It became a 9,354 foot mountain.
Wow.
And so almost a mile of vertical
Holy
cap
cow.
got blown off,
Blown up?
melted,
Yeah.
otherwise ejected. And the mountain was a mile shorter than it was before, almost. The largest observed eruption in history, making it the second largest eruption in history.
Behind
Because
the
this
one
one
that
was
you told
observed.
us about.
And
Wow.
since the name of the late antique Little Ice Age, since that, this was the largest eruption, and still is the second largest.
I have a question.
Sure.
Did you guys, like in my childhood, and you didn't tell me, there was some sort of explosion that caused me to lose about a mile of height, and that's why I'm so short? Or is there something like that we didn't really cover?
No, not in your childhood, but in my childhood, when I was 6, Mount St. Helens erupted in Washington State. And I grew up in Los Angeles, 1,000 miles south of that. That explosion was violent enough to blow the entire side off the mountain, and ash fell down on me in Los Angeles, 1,000 miles away. That explosion ejected a quarter of a cubic mile of ejecta from the mountain. This one at Mount Tambora was 76 times as much ejecta.
Wow.
19 cubic miles of
Wow.
rock became lava, ash, and tephra.
And what?
Tephra, Tephra, which is it's not a specifically aggregated mineral, like you can say tephra is this percent of this, but it has sulfates in it, sulfur oxide, and it's basically it's rock that comes out of a volcano is called tephra, and sometimes it falls, sometimes it's just atomized, it's just powderized, and this from Mount Tambora was ejected so far up that it hit the stratosphere above the cloud line.
Oh my gosh.
And when that happens, rain does not wash it out anymore. So it's just up there until such a time when these tiny particles finally settle down. And that can and does take a decade sometimes.
What? That's bananas. I never heard of that.
I'm
Yeah.
also still marveling over the fact that ejecta is a word. Like, ejecta is just something that is ejected. I love it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to start using back formations to create words like that out of other words. Like, I just threw you a throwa. It's a ball. But I'm calling it a throwa now.
It's like, in your car, you might have an ejecta seat.
No, boo, dad joke.
So in Europe, times were very grim. There were already previous eruptions that limited crop yields, and the Napoleonic Wars limited labor because so many men were dead, and food shortages. They were building off of that, and they worsened after Tambora, and they hit low temperatures, heavy rains, washing things out, flooding things, and crops were failing. Prices rose due to scarcity, and they had to ship long distance sometimes. So things were scarce, not much to go around, and what is going around is very expensive. So poor people really didn't have much. A lot of famine and death, leading to demonstrations, riots, arson, and looting all across Europe.
Wow.
It was the highest levels of violence since the French Revolution, which admittedly was it finished 17 years prior to this.
And here's Mary Shelley just like walking around the graveyard, like hanging out, like reading a book on the grave while while there's, the famine and the ash and the
Yeah. But malnourishment and famine in turn triggered typhus epidemics, and that killed more people. Huge storms, abnormal rainfall, flooding of Europe's major rivers, including the Rhine, which we'll get back to. There was frost in August, and brown and red snow. And the colors, the snow colors, the sky color, the world was different because of this tephra up in the stratosphere. It was the Romantic period of painting. Here's another instance where I'm going to greatly simplify something very complex, and people can argue with me. But let's just pretend that the Romantic period of painting is summed up as generally realistic depictions of the world intended to convey emotion. And the focus is on the emotion. The style tends to be pretty realistic. And so the colors are realistic. You can compare paintings by the same artist before and after the volcanic event and see the colors changing. This is the same eye, the same judgment, the same style of painting. And there's bright greens and blues and white clouds, and there's people swimming and playing in an afternoon picnic. And then afterward, lots of browns and yellows and reds and themes that touch on religion, industry, darkness, dread, uncertainty, and despair. And that lasted for years. It's a period of the Romantic period. It's like a sub-period of it that looks different than it did and feels different than it did right before this.
What year did this happen again?
This was in 1815.
Okay, so 1814 is when Percy Shelley came to visit, and they fell in love. So it's just like right after that, this happens.
Yeah. Let's get to general influence around the world. Okay. So in China, in part because of lack of food, poverty was everywhere. People were fighting to stay alive, and people are in despair. Sometimes when people are in despair, they turn to substances to make them feel better. And this was the rise of the opium trade in China.
Wow.
A lot of them will come back in this story for sure.
And in addition to the typhus, an outbreak of cholera all over the world killed millions. But at the same time, the research into the cholera, this was the right time for that to happen. It formed the basis of modern medicine and how we deal with diseases now. In Germany, in 1817, in Karlsruhe, Baden, Germany, the Rhine had overflowed, very little sunlight, poor conditions, and oats are not growing, but they're heavily dependent on horses. And the horses eat the oats. They can't feed the horses. There are horse famines and they're dying, and they relied on the horses for transportation. And a man named Carl Drees invented a machine called the velocipede. A pede from foot, fast foot, basically. I guess that's what that is, or foot speed. It had 2 wheels and a seat and handlebars that could steer the front wheel.
Bicycle.
Yeah, without pedals, without brakes. You use your feet. You reach down with your feet and you push off the ground and you go, and then you drag your feet on the ground to stop.
So both the goth aesthetic and bicycles were invented because of this.
Yeah. But it didn't have shocks, so when you drive it on carriage paths, it's all bumpy and it wasn't practical. But then when it was on streets, it went too fast and was thought to be a danger and was banned in Germany, Great Britain, the US, and Calcutta, which shows how popular it was and how far-reaching it got before it was banned. And now we have bicycles. Now we have brakes and shocks and pedals and stuff.
Yeah, Mom's up there on her electric bike going like 30 freaking miles per hour, a menace on wheels. They would have hated her back then.
Yeah. Yeah, just 65 miles north of there, in Darmstadt, Justus von Liebig was a teenager living through this, and he was inspired to go on to introduce mineral fertilizers to the world to help with crop yields. The other direction, less than 300 miles south, in 1816, Lord Byron, Claire Claremont, Dr. John William Polidori, Percy Shelley, and Mary Godwin took a trip to Lake Geneva. While they were there, the gloom and relentless rain kept them from doing their normal vacation activities. So they couldn't go outside much, and all they had to do was gather at the house that Byron was renting, Villa Diodati. And so at this point in the story, I'm going to hand off to Zoe, who knows what happened after they were cooped up in this house.
All right, I want like some really cool like heist intro music where we're about to introduce a cast of kooky characters. There we go. All right. First up, the only person in this story that we are legally allowed to call a hoe is the man himself, Lord Byron, just separated scandalously from his wife, fleeing England amidst accusations of possible incestuous affairs with his half-sister, Augusta Lee. They shared a father, Mad
My face
Jack
right
Byron.
now is like,
It's a very negative looking face.
okay.
Lady Byron had the wife, who's a mathematician, very cool, the mother of Ada Lovelace with Lord
Snaps to Ada Lovelace.
Byron. She had these journals that she wrote that she suspected that he was having an affair with his half sister, and those were posthumously published by Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Oh, go girl.
Everybody's part of this story.
Yeah. He rolls up in a replica, purportedly, of Napoleon's coach with a peacock, a monkey, a dog, and his personal physician, John Polidori.
Okay, I'm just saying, like, there's a little scale, right? And on one side of this scale is like Lord Byron and this peacock and this monkey and the carriage, and it's like, and then on the other side, it's like, but maybe you had sex with your sister.
Lord Byron was off the fucking rails, as you will discover in this story.
I
if
can't
you
wait.
didn't already know. Yeah, with him he brought his personal physician, Dr. John Polidori, who
John
also
Doctor John Polidori.
John Dr. John. And he also had inclinations to be a writer, but he was at the start of this, he hung out with Byron a lot as his personal physician, but also like going to parties with him and stuff. And while he wanted to be a writer, he was often ridiculed by Byron amongst, fine company for
Aw.
his sophomoric attempts at writing.
Poor John Doctor John.
Yeah, so John Dr. John lived in Byron's shadow, but he rolled up with him in May of 1816 to Villa Diodati in Switzerland off Lake Geneva. Who catches word of this? None other but Claire Claremont, 18 years old, stepsister of Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin at the time,
Yeah.
not Mary Shelley until later that year. They're both 18. Mary has a 4-month-old baby. Claire Claremont is pregnant with Lord Byron's baby. She had been Byron's lover, also probably / possibly Percy Shelley's. It's debated. It was debated at the time and continues to be. But, well, she decided that I'm pregnant with this dude's baby. He's not talking to me. Let's get a vacation house right by their vacation house and go make this like a party. This girl, Claire, is a controversial figure in this story. She's portrayed as kind of like a crazy woman, so I'm guessing she wasn't.
Yeah,
because
then
that's
she
how that
probably
usually
wasn't.
goes.
Yeah.
The whole story of her is she was originally named Jane, but she wanted to change her name to something more romantic, so she changed it to Claire Claremont. And she went with Mary when she ran away with Percy Shelley. She loved reading. She was actually better educated than Mary Shelley because her mother married Mary Shelley's father, and she got sent to a fancy boarding school. So like she was fluent in French.
And Mary's all just like
read...
reading on a gravestone.
Well, Claire Claremont was pretty intense as well. She loved King Lear. She said that she was so stirred by Cordelia that she had, quote unquote, one of her horrors. She went around having apparently hysterical fits like a lot, and she and Mary Shelley would like do that with each other. They would try to freak each other out by like sharing visions and then like have hysteria together and like intense nightmares.
Yeah, that
awesome.
sounds like teenage
them.
girls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're both 18. So Claire, Mary Shelley.
I feel like you and your friends were having some hysteria sometimes.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, just normal teenage girl stuff. So they
Except
went
for they're
with Percy
pregnant
Shelley.
with
Right. She's
famous
pregnant.
poets' children.
So they and Percy Shelley go and they rent a house right nearby, the Maison Chapuis.
Chapuis.
It's, you know what? We're going to roll with that pronunciation. They were adjacent summer houses 4 miles north of Lake Geneva. They roll up there, and Mary, we have a lot of her journals from that time. So she thought it was beautiful. Like the blue of the water was intensely beautiful and apparently inspired some of the scenes in Frankenstein where she was writing about the beautiful blue of the water of the lake. Then they get there to this lovely summer place, and, well, it's May, and they are trapped inside by this year with no summer, and they have to spend 3 days in the house. So all of them go to Byron's villa, and there are already some very weird relationships going on between them. Dr. John. Oh no, it's expanded.
Excuse me, doctor is my middle name.
Mr. Polidori is
He didn't spend 4 years in medical school to be called Mister.
Yeah, get it right. He spent 8 years so he could be called doctor twice.
Dr. John Doctor.
Sorry. Dr. John, Mr. Polidori. He was in love, or at least pining over, Mary Shelley, who, although not married to Percy, was, had his child. They were a couple. Polidori was not getting any, but everyone, I guess, knew that he was into her. And Byron is there, confronted by now the woman who's pregnant with his child. Woman is a strong term. She was 18. And here's what he wrote about her at the time. I found her with Shelley and her sister at Geneva. I never loved her nor pretended to love her, but a man is a man, and if a girl of 18 comes prancing to you at all hours of the night, there is but one way.
Oh, man.
So they rekindle their affair.
Well, what are you going to do?
On account of the prancing.
I mean, there is but one way.
Yeah, the story goes that he was like, no, I fucking hate you. And then he had
she
sex
did a
with
little
her
prance.
over this. Yeah, and then she pranced. And he was like, well, what you gonna do about it? We're stuck inside. But what they did do about it was, right, so all of this kind of like debauchery
That's
is
when
happening.
he wrote Baby It's Cold Outside, right?
Byron proposes a challenge. They are stuck in this villa, and they've all been reading Phantasmagoriana, which is this compendium of German ghost stories that were translated into French, which is, I'm going to break in here and say, this is why I think it's so interesting that you said the movie had German film influences, because Frankenstein, the book, was influenced by these German ghost stories they were reading.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I appreciate how you're talking and then you're like, and I'm going to break in here. As if you're breaking into something.
Pardon me. Let me interrupt myself for a moment, please. No, but you can talk again. Okay, thank you. So Byron's challenge was that they all try to write a ghost story that was better than the ones that they just read in Phantasmagoriana, which is a lot of
Phantasmagoriana is
syllables.
the name of my Evanescence cover band.
So Byron writes The Prisoner of Chillon? Chillon? Chillon. And he writes the third canto of his long, I don't know if it's technically considered an epic poem or not, but Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. He writes those while they're there. Percy Shelley writes a poem called Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. And the Dark Horse, Dr. John Polidori, writes The Vampire, based on an idea, a short story that Byron writes and then discards. Polidori is like, I am going to write the first ever vampire novel. I mean, he probably wasn't thinking that when he wrote it, but this was the beginning of vampire literature, and he is the most unknown name of, Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, but part of that is because when The Vampire got published later, it was published mistakenly under Byron's name.
Aww.
Which really added to the resentment of always being in Byron's shadow.
It may have sold the book better though.
Well, Byron was like, I didn't write it. It was all him. He was a little bit disparaging towards it. It was like, I definitely did not write that. Don't go around saying I wrote that. And Polidori's name kind of gets dragged through the mud in this, which is, I can't fathom how any of that is his fault. But I'll table that and get back to what happens to him when I do my little, where are they now?
Dead.
They're all dead. But but Mary Shelley writes, drumroll please, Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus.
Woot woot.
I knew that one.
It's told that they were having lots of wine, they were doing laudanum, and she had a dream, or a nightmare that inspired her. And also she had been hearing, there had been conversations in the house about galvanism, and that conjured the ideas of reanimation, and clearly all this other stuff that we were talking about. She was already very invested in the macabre. Percy Shelley also was said to have had a nightmare in which Mary sprouted demonic eyes where her nipples should be, but that one did not turn into a famous novel,
I feel
so
like
we're
maybe
gonna
that's
table
in a
that.
Ken Russell movie.
And what's the point? You don't even increase your field of vision. Like eyes in the back of your head, I can get.
Eyes on your
Under your shirt.
where your nipples would be, but on your back.
Yes, where my
No,
back
but
nipples are. I mean, I don't
in
have those.
the
I'm cutting all this.
You keep saying that, but then you don't cut the thing.
I'm cutting back
in
nipples for sure.
So in the foreword to, I don't know if it was the original release of the book or the one right after, she wrote in the introduction her dream. She said, I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life. Claire Claremont did not write a book, or she was, she actually liked writing and thought about being, delving into literary pursuits. But she said, in our family, if you cannot write an epic or novel that by its originality knocks all other novels on the head, you are a despicable creature not worth acknowledging.
Oh.
Wow. Our family is not like that. We do
Because we
derivative
all
stuff
do
all the
just,
time. Right now, we're talking about other people's works.
You can really just put out anything in this family. We encourage it.
she clearly had a lot of insecurity there. Maybe it was true. There's this idea that when John Polidori wrote The Vampire about this monster that sucks the life out of you, that he might have really been writing inspired by Lord Byron. And that when Mary Shelley wrote about Frankenstein and Dr. Frankenstein and this narcissistic intellectual who will love you and then neglect you, she was talking about Percy. One note about, I'm kind of really interested in Mr. Dr. John, because he is one of the people I didn't know as much about before doing this research, but apparently he did his thesis when he got his doctorate at Edinburgh, which he got at age 19. It was on somnambulism. So they were all goth as hell. He was also the uncle of the painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who's a pre-Raphaelite. I know of him because through The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, a play that I was in that referenced it a lot.
So this guy was pretty cool. This
Dr.
This
guy
John
was pretty
Dr.
cool.
Pomodori was cool.
Right. So they all write these things, and that is in 1816. So Mary Shelley marries Percy and becomes Mary Shelley later that year. Claire Claremont soon has her child that Byron is the father of. Frankenstein gets published not long after. In 1821, Dr. John Polidori commits suicide, probably by cyanide. People didn't rule it as a suicide at the time, but we know now that it was. The next year, in 1822, Percy Shelley drowns in a freak storm. Also that year, in 1822, well, let's backtrack. The daughter that Claire Claremont has with Byron, her name is Allegra, and Byron gets custody of the child pretty quickly, and Claire is allowed, quote unquote, a few brief visits with her daughter. And then Byron sends her off to a convent in Italy. And Claire is super mad because she's like, we agreed that our daughter would never have to be apart from one of her parents. And she thought that the convent was like really shitty quality and that it was like unhealthy and the education was really bad. He sends the daughter anyways. And she decides to try to kidnap her daughter from the convent and asks Percy Shelley to forge a letter from Byron saying that it's okay for Allegra to leave with her. And Percy Shelley's like, no. Then in March of 1822, so the same year that Percy Shelley dies, this 5-year-old daughter, Allegra, dies at the convent, probably from typhus, either
Oh.
typhus or malarial type fever.
Wow. And the typhus and possibly the
Right.
freak storm. Those all could have been influenced by the volcano.
Right. I was thinking about that when you said that like typhus was on the rise. Claire never forgives him, is very mad at him for the rest of her life. But Byron dies 2 years later in 1824 after a fever.
Do you have the other information? Because if you don't, I do, about all the other
about
people.
Byron's death?
No, like the other people in Mary's life that died.
No, go right ahead.
Well, after they're at the villa, they go back to England, and Percy's wife kills herself in October, and then in December, Mary Shelley's older sister kills herself, Franny Emily.
Man.
And then when they're on this trip that they were talking about before Percy dies in this boating accident, when they're going around Italy, the baby William that Mary gave birth to before going to Italy, and then the child that was born after that, they both die.
Both?
Yes, both of her children die. And at one point, Percy Shelley said, I hope he didn't say this in a blamey way, but it was like, I've been with you for 5 years, and it's been the worst 5 years of my life. Which I think he's saying that, like, all of our children die, and all, like, people we know are dying. Like, it's a terrible time. They had one surviving child, and Percy Florence, he was named.
Yeah, between 1821 and 1824, every man that was there is dead, and Claire's baby. Mary and Claire are the only ones to live past 50 years old, and Claire lives the longest of any of them, which I'm not saying is, it's definitely, this is all a tragedy, but also they painted her as like the crazy woman for wanting to be with Byron. Like that was how Claire, all the sources I was looking at talked about her, was that she was just like this crazy teenage chick who's like obsessed with him and wouldn't leave him alone. And I'm like, she was a teenager pregnant with his baby. So if she gets to live the longest, good for her.
Also, if he had left her alone, then she wouldn't.
Right. And then he stole her baby away from her and sent it off, and then she couldn't see it. And then the baby died. So, yeah. Claire Claremont is one of the tragic heroes of this story, in my opinion.
Okay, does this story pick
Even
up at
though
all?
she
Does
isn't
it
a
become
writer.
happy in any way?
Well, then, Mary Shelley has the first sci-fi novel, and it becomes a really good movie.
Yeah, I have some happy news.
What?
Mary Shelley was maybe bisexual.
Ooh.
That would be happy news.
Yeah, so
I don't know why I made a creepy noise, but it's like, oh, the ghost.
No, it's fair. She's goth.
after Percy Shelley died, Mary wrote to a friend about her loneliness. She said, I was so ready to give myself away, and being afraid of men, I was apt to get tousy-mousy for women.
Well, that's pretty conclusive.
Tousy-mousy.
I love getting tousy-mousy with women.
Yeah, there's a specific woman named Jane Williams that Percy was also probably, I'm trying to think of, I first thought sticking it to, but that's not very nice.
Sticking it in.
Okay. And her husband, James Williams' husband, died with Percy in the boating accident. And so then
Wow.
Jane and Mary were like left together. And Mary also, if not bisexual, although if you look up on lists of bisexual people, she's often on that list. I think Byron is as well, right?
Probably.
She's at least a friend because she helped finance a lot of different feminist causes. And one was she gave money to a lesbian couple and helped one of them establish an identity as a man so they could live as a
That's
couple.
amazing.
Yeah.
I would say the happy parts of this story are also always just in this undercurrent of darkness, because the parts where it's like, woo, wine, laudanum, free love, we're atheists and we're like super intellectual, and isn't it cool, like we hang out in cemeteries and romantic era and we write amazing works, and I mean, like Percy Shelley like influenced Yeats and all this stuff we love. But I think probably, I think their vision of a world was beautiful, but I do feel like their lives, while they wanted to be romantics, I think they might have been romantic to them, but looking back on it, are quite sad.
Yeah, it seems very difficult
I
what they
think
lived through.
maybe romantic and sad are not so far apart. I think a lot of the romantic art was based on whatever the strongest emotions are, and sadness, grief, it can be right up there.
So, what do we think? Is the movie Frankenstein at its heart a romantic movie?
I think it is. I think it tries to portray the situation, the premise that it's given, realistically,
With the emotions.
with the emotions. And they did a lot of show not tell.
And you know what? Some people hated this movie. So it was censored really heavily. It was banned in Kansas because it showed quote unquote cruelty and tended to debase morals.
Yes.
Oh yeah, I did that.
It was, I mean, people kind of flipped out, which I think there's just so many interesting parallels between the movie and the book, and like the way it changed the German influence, the way it changed the genre, or like existed in as a foundational text of a genre that didn't exist in that form yet.
And possible, LGBT.
Yep.
I have two just like cute funny facts if we want to lighten the mood a little. So Boris Karloff's costume weighed 48 pounds. His shoes were like this fancy kind of shoes that were like 12 pounds each or something. That
Fancy
made it
and
really hard
heavy.
for him
Oh,
to
that
walk
makes
in
sense.
them.
You can see
Yeah.
that when he walks.
I think you would like this, Zoe, that after all the long hours and like dangerous conditions that Boris Karloff had to live through on the set of Frankenstein, he got behind a new movement to unionize the screen actors. And he was one of the founding members. I think he was number 9 or 10 founding members of the Screen Actors Guild. And their meeting was, they met secretly in Boris Karloff's garage.
Oh,
SAG-AFTRA started in Boris Karloff's garage.
That's right. Yeah, that's our true events that inspired this wonderful book and this wonderful movie. I hope you enjoyed that. We have a giveaway going on that we told people if they leave a review for us on Apple Podcasts that we will do a little Film Fam treatment of their movie. And our first reviewer had left this review before we had advertised about the giveaway. So they got in touch with us and told us the movie they want us to talk about. Zoe, can you say the movie?
The movie is Elf.
Elf.
Let us tell you the true story behind the movie Elf.
I know this one.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
luckily I did this research to find out the true story behind the movie Elf. It's actually really a true story of a little boy who saw his mama kissing Santa Claus, and he thought, Mommy only kisses Daddy. What if Santa is my real dad?
Yeah.
So he follows Santa and Mommy back up to Mommy and Daddy's room, and he sees
Oh no.
Santa remove the white beard, and oh my gosh, it is Daddy. But instead of thinking that his father was dressed up as Santa, this little boy thought Santa was just pretending to be a regular guy and that his father really was Santa.
Yeah, no, but
That makes sense.
it's darker than that because the parents didn't approve, and he didn't tell the rest of the family this. But one night, he's out delivering presents and stuff. He plans this out in advance, runs over the grandma with a reindeer.
That yes,
Oh,
that
that
is
is
that is dark part of. But this little boy, he spends the whole next year trying to keep his father's secret, but also trying to let Daddy Santa know that, like, Daddy Santa, Santa Daddy. What do you think?
Oh,
I think it's Daddy Santa Daddy.
Daddy Santa Daddy, let him know that he like definitely approved of this new development in their family life. Like he's like, oh, my dad is Santa. Imagine all the presents, all the cookies, flying on reindeers. He's really into it. And the boy really, he wants to embrace his heritage as the son of Santa. So like he starts wearing a lot of like red and green and like a big belt. He's wanted to let his dad know, like, we're not talking about it. I get it, but I'm here with you. I'm your elf child. So He says he just always wants like cookies and milk for dinner because he thought that was like Santa's main food group.
That's correct.
He spends every afternoon like coming after he comes home from school, like cutting out little paper snowflakes and stuff. And like he's always singing Christmas carols. And this goes on like through like January and February and into spring. By like the end of the school year, he's told all the kids in his class that he's written their names on a list and he's going to be watching them.
Yeah.
This is where things start to get really out of hand. By Halloween, he tells his mom, I want to go trick-or-treating as all 12 days of Christmas.
And it inspired not only the movie Elf, but I'll Be Watching You by the Police.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
It's both inspired by the same true event.
Yeah.
So then the holiday season comes around and his mom says, I'm going to take you to the mall to sit on Santa's lap. And the boy's like, this is it. This is when Daddy Santa Daddy is going to reveal to me his true identity.
I'm so scared of where this is
We're going to move to the North Pole. Oh, you know where it's going though. Because he gets there and it's not Dad Santa Daddy. And that's the scene from Elf. That's where they got that from. He says, you sit on a throne of lies. And then he fights him.
Did it also inspire that scene in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where he bites Santa in the face?
I thought you were going to say it was Uncle Santa Daddy.
Did you fuck my mom?
Well,
I have a behind the scenes fact from that. So when they were filming Elf, Will Ferrell was like really decided to be very method, right? So they were filming it for like 10 months, and he only every day wore the elf suit. He did not wear any other clothes, even in his normal life. It was because he was like, I need to get into the character. He only hung out with people like a lot smaller than him.
He went to the North Pole and lived
time.
as an elf.
Yeah, and he was really cold because he like swore to only wear that outfit. And he was like, oh God, I'm like sure, like he got pneumonia, but he was committed to the craft, and thus Elf was made.
yes, that.
He only ate pasta with maple syrup.
Well, that was based on this kid who only wanted to eat cookies and stuff.
Sure.
You know that's what they based
Farrell
it
was
on.
like, I need to get into the mind of this real kid.
Yeah.
He was going to interview him and everything, but the kid was like in jail by then. It was an issue.
I wasn't going to talk about that. I didn't want to out this little kid and all the stuff that happened.
This has been.
Nope, we're not using real names.
We're not using his real name. So thank you for writing us a review. We do have some more, and we'll be giving these little based on true events.
Absolute bullshit. Oh, right. Yeah. Completely real things that we just said.
We'll be doing more of those. Zoe, do you have a song for us this week?
Yes, I do. I wrote a song. It is from the point of view of Frankenstein's monster, or the creature, as I like to affectionately call him.
Creechy.
Mr. Creech. And it encompasses some of the stuff from the book, which means like stuff from Bride of Frankenstein. So if you need an incentive to go watch that one as well, I would highly recommend it. That'll be playing right after this.
Like Film Fam, inspired by true events. Subscribe to hear more stories that inspired our favorite films.
For photos and links from the show and other shenanigans, follow us at Instagram at FilmFamPodcast, on Twitter at FilmFam_podcast, and on Facebook at FilmFam Inspired by True Events.
If you have any questions, comments, corrections, or films whose inspiration you would like us to explore, you can email us at filmfampodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you all for listening. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
I wasn't afraid of fire until I tasted it down my throat. I wasn't afraid to drown until I learned what doesn't float. And nobody told me that flesh can be so heavy. And nobody told me that I would seem so ugly. Maybe the blind could love me. Maybe my mind could be lovely. If I am gentle, if I know reason, if I have words and know how to speak them, maybe the blind could love me. I wasn't in search of God until he screamed at the sun.